Overhead, the clouds looked swollen, not with rain, but something worse, something infected. Seeing this, the face of the man on the spotted Appaloosa curled into a grimace. The last thing he wanted right then was to be outside when those clouds finally let go of whatever they were holding on to. About a mile back, the town had just barely caught his eye. Hell, if he hadn't been up on that ridge, Frank might have ridden right on by. And that would have meant another night under the stars, another 10 hours of jumping at every sound, pointing iron at every snap and rustle. No doubt about it, after almost 2 weeks on the trail, the man was all sorts of ready to rejoin civilization. The simple fact was, given a choice, Frank McGrath much preferred the finer things: comfort and company, flavor and taste, and all the rest. To Frank, these were the things that made life worth living, things which on principle he was only too happy to pay for. Unfortunately, the spending of dollars had always come a lot easier than earning them. Even for someone like Frank, who was in fact a fair bit smarter than he looked. Hell, once upon a time, the man almost finished the 5th grade. Of course, that was back in the life that was, before circumstance had reshaped him into something more likely to survive on the surface of the sun. It was almost funny. Now he could hardly remember the boy named Francis, the one who had peered into his school books, not seeing the words printed there, but rather a life of action, women, and desperados, of the kind of hellfire that comes out of the end of a revolver. You know, I think I'm actually reading an older version of this. This might not be the one that's printed, but hey, fuck it, we're in it now. With a weary head shake, Frank licked his lips. His tongue prodded the cracks it found, but was too damn dry to do anything about it. God, he needed a drink, and maybe that was exactly what was waiting for him up ahead, in this unexpected burg in the middle of nothing. Carried by the sluggish gait of his horse, Frank looked from one empty side of the street to the other. Back on the ridge, the town had caused a wave of relief to wash over the man on the spotted Appaloosa. It had been the first settlement he'd glimpsed since barreling out of San Miguel in a storm of hot dust and cold lead. And at the time, he couldn't. Sorry, I was just distracted. It's a really loud car just drove by. At the time, he couldn't imagine anything prettier. Now that he was here, though, Frank's second life instincts were starting to prickle. His eyes moved over the dirt, dilapidated fences and buildings, shifting from left to right and back again. Even in this state, Frank could name a handful of settlements along Young Territory's eastern ridge. Could this be Knox, Haskell, or maybe Taylor? As a rule, Frank despised not knowing where he was and exactly what he was riding into. What was he supposed to do? Turn around? Pass by the first sanctuary he'd found in weeks? His only chance at a real bed and maybe a drink? Hell no. No way. Frank McGrath was a hell of a lot of things, but he wasn't stupid. As open country narrowed into a street, he continued to soak in the surroundings. There were a few signs a bit further in, but they didn't help much. General Dry Goods and Merchandise, read one. Another proclaimed D.A. Virgil Cigars. Them and a few more actually pointed to a thriving burg, but something felt off. Every building was just a little too dark, too run down. The street didn't feel empty the way streets tend to when honest folks have all turned in or are just trying to stay out of the rain. What it felt was deserted. As Frank mused on this, a sudden rustling turned his head. Next to what must have been the town livery was a corral holding a number of horses. The animals looked healthy and well tended to. As he rode closer, they lazily raised their heads. Well, Frank counted the 12 animals. At least this ain't no ghost town. The words were the first he'd spoken in almost 2 days. As he said them, an insidious worm-like tickle insinuated itself behind his tongue. Not wanting to announce himself just yet, Frank quietly cleared his throat. His mind shifting more and more to that drink he hoped was just around the corner. It was another minute or so before he heard it, the distinct tinkle of piano keys. You hear that? Frank asked the horse, not really expecting a reply. I'll be damned. His mind began to drift back to San Miguel, to the woman with the fire-red hair, the one that had smelled of strawberries and cigar smoke. The way her hips had moved to the sound of that piano tune, and how she had come in on the second verse to a song Frank McGrath knew well. The Pecos Queen, he shook his head, of all the goddamn songs. The spotted Appaloosa was urged to a stop before the obvious source of the music. The building had been erected right at the bend of the road and thankfully was labeled. Red letters adorned a dark wood sign, but were more weather-beaten than the face of the man trying to read them. Castigation Saloon. The words came slow and were punctuated by one more. Well, I can't say I love the sound of that. The horse gave a loud snort. Never heard of Castigation, Texas. New Mexico, neither. After once more sweeping his eyes behind and around, Frank leaned over to one side and spit. Then, following a clumsy dismount, he latched the horse to a post. As the animal lowered its head to a nearby trough, Frank's gaze lingered on the water. The surface looked like glass, like the darkest shade of black he had ever seen. For an instant, he could see the reflection of those ugly pregnant clouds, but then the water began to roil as the Appaloosa took its first good drink in days. As Frank looked to the doors ahead, he felt the first drops of rain on the brim of his hat. He took a deep breath and let it out slow. Wherever in the hell this place was, he'd apparently made it here just in time. With a slow creak, the door swung inward and banged against a small bell. The chime was startling, explosive, louder than dynamite in the dusty saloon. The newcomer's eyes narrowed and scanned. To his pleasant surprise, the place was considerably less empty than the street had been. In fact, many of the Castigation's tables were occupied by some rough-looking customers, all of them hunched over their drinks. As he began to cross the room, Frank's eyes swept over his fellow customers. His second life had afforded countless opportunities to be surrounded by men of this ilk, ugly, mean, and usually without any notion of how excruciatingly dumb they were. Just a handful of your standard-issue bushwhackers, hustlers, and sidewinders, all maybe, except for that one in the back. The Mexican had the darkest corner of the room all to himself. And like everyone else in the place, he seemed to be just sitting there, just contemplating his glass. Suddenly aware that he was staring, Frank faced front and approached the bar. Hello? His eyes were already devouring the half-full bottles of brown liquid lining the shelves. There was a room behind the bar, a room with a half-closed door and flickering candlelight just beyond. Anyone back there? When no answer came the second time, Frank took a breath. Then he slid one hand down the bar's surface. The wood was cool to the touch, polished and fine with brass accents. The distant cry from the worn, splintery surfaces of the bar he was used to sliding up to. A distant cry from the worn, splintery surfaces of the bars he was used to sliding up to. Impressed, Frank raised an eyebrow. Mounted behind the wall was a large rectangular mirror. It wasn't hard to relocate the man in the back, that big, swollen Mexican who continued to sit in his dark corner, just as still as ever. Looking only at the reflection, Frank tried his damnedest to think. The Mexican felt familiar, but he couldn't figure out why. Frustrated, his eyes began sweeping over the rest of the tables. There were 3 other tables with occupants. 2 held 3 bushwhacker types, and there was one more with just a pair. 9 in total, and not a one of them was doing much of anything. Every now and then a man would lift his glass, then stop before it reached his lips and put it back down again. It was almost as if these poor bastards had other things on their mind, as if, in reality, they were miles away. Altogether, it was damn weird. Frank's eyes moved then to an old piano. Like the bar itself, the instrument sat unattended. Suddenly, He realized that he couldn't recall the moment the music had stopped playing. In fact, the tune to the Pecos Queen was so fresh in his mind he almost started humming the damn thing. You play? The question sounded more like a statement of fact than a question. His eyes snapped over to see an attractive woman emerge from the room behind the bar. Her hair hung just past her shoulders and was blonde in the truest sense, yellow, like a prairie flower, like a ray of morning sun. The sight stirred something, reminding Frank McGrath that a man needed more than a little red eye to get him through. Well, she jibed. As he looked to those pools of hazel green, he suddenly discovered that he was no longer thirsty. Politely, he tipped his hat. Ma'am, he stammered like a boy of 12 before straightening up. I'm sorry? Well, said the woman, you're eyeballing that piano like it owes you money. Thought maybe you were looking for work. Oh, Frank shook his head. No, ma'am, not me. Besides, from the sound of things, you already got yourself a fine player around here somewhere. I heard him before. The woman crooked her head in confusion. Before? Yeah, not 2 minutes ago, as I was coming up the street. You tell him break's over. It's been a while since I heard music like that. Be fine to hear some more. Mister, I don't know what you're talking about. No one's touched that piano in months. Last player I had was Duncan Styles, and he's been dead close to 3 months. She pursed her lips, shook her head in apparent regret. So, what'll it be? A glass was slammed down. The sound was so loud and sudden it sent a jolt through Frank's bones, one strong enough to make him feel as if his manhood had just been questioned. Whiskey, he nodded. Moving with no great urgency, the woman procured a bottle and a glass, turning back with what Frank could have sworn was the start of a smile. The sight, combined with the woman's alternating sway of hair and hip, was in a way that caused the aforementioned stirring to intensify in Frank's guts, there and lower. Refusing to drop that ghost of a smile, the blonde woman poured a stream of gold liquid from bottle to glass. The sight was perfection. All the sweetness and warmth of a lover's caress for 5 cents a whack. Hell, the sight and the smell alone were enough to make his knees buckle. Frank reached for the glass, but the bartender pulled it back. You got the money? Just like that, 3 little words was all it took to sour Frank's newly managed contentment. With a frown, he slapped a hand flat on the bar, then moved it away to reveal a nickel. All right, then, said the woman, slowly sliding the glass forward. Looking only moderately annoyed, Frank eyeballed the woman before disappearing the glass's contents in one swallow. The whiskey was cheap stuff, but he reveled in the sensation as it slid down his throat and past his ribs. And when that liquid heat came to rest deep in his belly, Frank McGrath was just a little closer to being whole again. Where are we, anyhow? He asked this in an even tone, placing down another nickel. Oh, she raised an eyebrow. Just another bump on the road to tarnation. Most don't stay long enough to remember they were here at all. In that moment, the woman seemed to trail off, as if remembering she still had a kettle on. What about you, mister? Where you coming from? Nothing east of here but mountains and saddle sores. As the fire died down in his belly, another one sparked elsewhere. He had asked a very straight and simple question, one which the woman would have no logical reason to dodge. He hated that. Didn't like when people assumed he was too dumb to smell bullshit. East, Frank managed to keep his tone light. Did I say something about coming across the territory? I come here from El Paso, he lied. Then he tossed a few more coins onto the bar and pushed forward his glass. The bartender blinked real slow, the way only a woman can. For a second there, Frank thought that things had already started down the wrong path, and he hated that too. How women were always treating him this way, putting words in his mouth, not answering simple questions. My mistake. To Frank's surprise, the woman's tone verged on playful. Without another word, she raised the bottle and poured. This time, a drop splashed back out into the dark wood surface. Without missing a beat, the bartender took her finger and wiped up that drop. Then, inserting the tip into her mouth, she cleaned it with a crisp pop. Needless to say, the sight had quite the effect on her trail-weary customer. Never a fan of being transparent, Frank cleared his throat and drank. The first gulp was fire, but the second was something more. With shut eyes, Frank stopped worrying about the answers he didn't have and just allowed himself to drift. "Sign out there says Castigation Saloon." He said this distantly, with a bit of sarcasm. "Is that what you call the town, too?" "That sign has faded some over the years. Been meaning to have it painted." The bartender picked up a second glass to clean it. "The family name is Costigan, but most just call me Ellie." Frank prickled, feeling once again that he was being lied to. "Sure looked like castigation to me." "As I said," the woman went on, her words starting to slow as she watched Frank remove his hat and lay it on the bar, "been meanin' to have it repainted." "You did say that." The words were dreamlike, but they seemed to conceal a warning. Frank's eyes were still closed, and his head lolled back. He never saw the woman's expression shift as she laid eyes on the horizontal scar that ran across his forehead. "You know," said Ellie after a few quiet moments, "it's kind of nice to meet a man who can read. Have to say, most of my customers just recognize the two O's in saloon and call it a day. Not often I get a man of culture in here." Again came the slow blink, but this time it held a different connotation. Ellie shifted her weight to the other hip, then leaned back. As she did this, her shirt collar moved to reveal the tanned skin of her collarbone. Frank was immediately frozen, galvanized. He wanted to reach across the bar right then, but no. There was no need to rush. This was nice. A little talk, plenty still to drink. The road had been long, and he was still so damn thirsty. He reached out, but the bartender pulled back the bottle. "Hey," he flared, "I ain't done with that." Another smile flickered across the woman's lips, this one positively wicked. "Oh, I think maybe you are." Moving as slow as she pleased, Ellie Costigan put that bottle back on its shelf. Then she reached under the bar itself. Frank couldn't see what she was doing, but he heard the distinctive sliding sounds of a metal latch being undone. "Try this." Ellie appeared with a new bottle in hand. "A high-class customer like yourself deserves a higher class of drink." Frank looked perplexed. His eyes flitted from the woman's smile to the bottle. Inside was something that looked a little like liquid gold, but there was something else in there, too. All coiled up in the bottom, the thing glared with hateful, slitted eyes that seemed to be daring Frank to make the first move. "That's a..." Frank's voice trailed off. "Rattlesnake," said Ellie with a sly wink. Frank's heart skipped a beat, but he didn't let the panic show. No reason to. After all, no one knew him all the way out here. Still, hearing that moniker, that same one they put on all the posters, put an itch in his trigger finger. "Being as cultured as you are, I'm sure you've heard of the worm in tequila." Ellie removed the topper, allowing a most alluring scent to prick at her customer's nostrils. "Well, I find nothing gives that special kick in the teeth quite like the devil himself." Trying to appear unshaken, Frank cleared his throat, wet his lips. "Is it dead?" Ellie laughed. "Of course it's dead, silly. Do you know any snakes that can breathe whiskey?" He stared back, just barely too perplexed to be offended. At that moment, he wanted golden liquid so bad it hurt. But something was off here. Had she just insulted him? Called him stupid? And for what? For asking a simple question? Hell, he had seen taxidermied snakes before, but The way this one bobbed in the liquid, shouldn't it be stiff? Well, said Ellie with a playful lilt, you want me to pour or what? Frank looked up, clearly stewing in his own vinegar. This your good stuff? The bartender nodded. What have you been selling me so far? Horse piss? Frank was losing his cool, already almost yelling. Maybe. Utterly unflapped, Ellie winked and started to pour. But I didn't realize I had a customer that could appreciate the finer things. And besides, that's my mistake. Then this next one's on the house. Frank's scar squirmed as hills and valleys appeared on his brow. And though his every fiber sure felt the woman was mocking him somehow, Frank could not stop staring at that snake. He kept expecting it to strike. In his head, he pictured it pouring right out with the drink, maybe falling to the bar with a loud splat before slithering away. Fortunately, neither of these things happened. In fact, as Ellie poured, that mean old rattler hardly moved at all. Wearing his frown like a badge, Frank was suddenly overcome with a powerful revelation. This woman had gotten him so riled up, he had raised his voice. And after he had tried so hard to stay calm and collected, real smart, he thought. With a heated sigh, Frank looked in the mirror. His eyes flitted from table to table, from man to man, finding not one who was looking his way. And before those other patrons of Costigan's saloon seemed content and pondering their own glass as if it were the goddamn meaning of life. Subconsciously, Frank recounted the heads. 7, he thought, counting once more. Definitely 7. Counting the mysterious Mexican. Frank shrugged, resolving that a couple must have slipped out when he had lost his cool. That was fine. Less was better. Besides, only one of them mattered. Still using the mirror, Frank's eyes returned to that swollen shape in the corner. There really was something about that damn Mexican, but what? Frowning, Frank picked up his glass. Then, like a flaming serpent, Miss Ellie's high-class stuff shot down into his belly. The sensation was ecstasy, a river of either paradise or perdition. In that moment, it was hard to know. Shit! The word was ejaculated as if by a man who had just been bitten by his own horse. Well, Ellie Costigan was smiling. I suppose I'll take that as a compliment. In that particular moment, she looked very pleased with herself. Still marveling at the flavor, Frank smacked his lips. The stuff was definitely whiskey, but like none that had ever crossed his palate. He could detect notes of all kinds, caramel and barley, and just the right balance of smoke. There was something else too, though, something subtle. He couldn't place it, something beneath the symphony. Slowly his eyes moved to the snake in the bottle. That there is an old family recipe. Ellie nodded proudly. Since Daddy went to heaven, I've been making it myself. I am very pleased it is to your liking. Liking may not be a strong enough word, darling. Again, Frank moved the glass to his lips, pausing to inhale before partaking of another sip. No point in denying it, the drink had him, body and soul. In fact, he had almost forgot about the big man in the back. Almost. After the last fiery drops slid past his tongue, Frank opened his eyes, more relaxed than a moment before. He looked up at the bartender, appreciating for the first time the freckles on the bridge of her nose and the ample roundness of her hips. And noticing that she was being noticed, Ellie Costigan placed a hand on her bar and leaned forward to improve the man's view. By God, the woman was beautiful. How much? All of a sudden, Frank was wearing a wolfish grin. Excuse me? Ellie sounded offended, but only slightly. For the bottle. Oh, $5. Ellie backed off and turned to put the glass she had been cleaning away. Worth every penny. $5? Frank's tone had picked up a discreet edge. Think I'm stupid? The woman raised an eyebrow but said nothing as a silver dollar was pushed across the bar. If the first glass was on the house, this should cover what's left. The bartender didn't look at the money, just kept staring at her only customer. After a few seconds, she set down the bottle, sliding it over. No. He held up a hand, not wanting to touch the thing. You can keep pouring. Without a word of response, the bartender did as requested and filled the glass again. Frank's smile broadened. His head felt heavy, but otherwise he felt just like a king. Just like he had back in San Miguel, when things had still been good, before that girl with the fire red hair had ruined everything. It had all come crumbling down so fast, all because he had gotten too comfortable to notice the revolvers at his back. As he brooded on this, something seemed to be needling the nerves in his spine. It was an old itch, one he hadn't thought about in a very long time. Frank pressed the glass to his forehead. Then he closed his eyes and allowed the coolness to enter his skin. Beneath that old scar across his forehead gave a single throb. He didn't want to look at the mirror again. Didn't want his night to be filled with any business that didn't involve this fine snake juice or even finer woman who was pouring it. Problem was, want had nothing to do with it. Slowly, carefully, Frank looked up at the reflection of the big man-shaped shadow in the back. That was when he felt every muscle in his body tense all at once. As Frank watched, that big Mexican leaned forward just a little more, enough for the light to catch a strap of what looked like boot leather across one of his eyes. You all right, mister? The voice hit like a kick to the gut. I'm fine, Frank lied again, his eyes moving to rest on the bottled snake. The head of that old rattler was completely free of the liquid now. He watched with dread as a single golden drop slid down one of the beast's fangs. Whoever had done the taxidermy had posed the snake with its mouth open, its teeth bared. The thing really did look ready to strike. Are you sure? Might be the light in here, but you look a little pale. I said I'm fine, Frank hissed. Might be even better if my glass wasn't empty. As she poured, a sneer flashed across the bartender's face, but the expression went unnoticed. In fact, Frank did look pale, and as he reached for his drink, it was with a trembling hand. In his mind, he was miles away. Years, too. There was no denying it. There was a very good reason that seeing that big Mexican had such an effect on Frank McGrath. Sitting there in the darkest corner of the Castigation Saloon was the scourge of Nevada County, Carlos Cortez. Some called him the Conquistador, but the bastard sure as hell wasn't from Spain. If accounts held, Cortez had killed between 20 and 46 men, women, and children. The posters never seemed to agree on the number. But if that was really Cortez, then why was he just sitting there? Had he not recognized old Rattlesnake McGraw when he moseyed in? Or could it be that so many years had passed the bastard had forgotten? No, not possible. Man forgets many faces in his span, but the son of a bitch who got your eye, that one you remember. Frank cursed himself in silent rage. To think he'd been stupid enough to raise his voice in a place he didn't know. Again, he drank deep of the snake liquor, though it completed him a little less. After only a few moments away, the mirror pulled his eyes back. The other tables were all empty now, probably cleared out. The other bushwhackers clearly preferring the storm outside to the one brewing in here. Why do you keep doing that? Statement was strange, but her lopsided grin eased his mounting nerves. Frank leaned forward. Damn it, woman, keep your voice down. That bottled rattler isn't the only snake in this bar. Hearing this, Ellie's face abandoned much of its warmth. Oh, is that right? She sounded consummately unsurprised. You goddamn right it's right. Frank's eyes were doing the bloodshot bugging out of his skull thing. Now, I need you to listen to me very closely. Here? Gingerly, the woman nodded. All right. You see that man in the far back? That big one-eyed Mexican? Ellie looked with her eyes only, real quick, just there and back. And though she gave no word, no nod of the head, Frank could tell she knew exactly who he meant. That there is Carlos Cortez. Catching the woman's gaze, he raised his eyebrows for emphasis. $1,000 reward, though I haven't seen too many posters lately. Tell you the God's honest, I heard he was dead. With an illegible expression, Ellie pulled out a cloth and began to wipe imaginary spills. Without looking up, she spoke in a quiet voice. I see. So he's a real dangerous then? Dangerous? Frank was shaking his head in disbelief. Sometimes women really were too stupid for their own goddamn good. The son of a bitch is wanted in 3 states, woman. He's killed at least 3 deputy marshals and maybe 100 regular folk. More important than that, he really doesn't like me. Oh? Ellie's voice was not nearly concerned enough. In fact, there was an undertone that gave the distinct impression that she thought this entire affair was funny. What's the matter? You cheat him in cards or something? Steal his favorite Bible? The expression of mild bemusement made no sense, and it was going right up Frank's ass. He was already at that stage, the one he always reached sooner or later with members of the fairer sex. Right then, the bar woman was transmogrified, no longer an amalgamation of skin and curves and hair and lips. Now she was a stupid mulin thing, a nail begging to be hammered. Problem was, Frank's typical knee-jerk reaction to this type of situation would draw too much attention. Though it tasted a bit like bile in his throat, Frank had to control himself. Right now, his best chance was to stay calm and collected, to hope that when the time was right, the enormous Mexican would be too deep in his cups to notice when he walked out the front door. In 2 swallows, Frank emptied the glass before pushing it forward again. What I did, the words came in a low, slurred whisper, was shoot him in the face. Ellie paused, looking thrown for the first time. It all happened pretty fast. We'd only been running together a couple of days. Me and Hodge, some jumpy Irish feller who kept talking about how he'd been struck by lightning, and him, El Conquistador. Campbell was the one who put the job together. Said it'd be easy, clean. Frank wiped down his brow on one sleeve before continuing in a hoarse whisper. Little did I know that Ted Campbell's definition of clean meant that Cortez would leave no one alive at the bank. Tellers, managers, customers. It was the wrong place and time for everyone that day. Frank lifted the newly refilled glass, again pressing it to his forehead, but no relief came. When had it gotten so goddamn hot in here? He tried to remember, but his head was too heavy, his thoughts almost too thick to process. We got out of there pretty quick, but somehow there were 2 deputies on our trail. To this day, I still don't know how they found us, but they did find us. One of them had a weird name like Nada or Nil, something like that. Something that meant nothing. He shrugged. Anyway, them bastards were good. Worked like they had a single brain between them. It wasn't long before they tracked us down to this little church about 5 miles outside of town. There was a wedding going on, and, big surprise, Cortez don't much care for those. Ellie backed away. When she spoke, her voice was very small, and to Frank's ear, womanish. And that's when you did it? When you shot him? Frank raised an eyebrow, though both of his eyes were more than halfway shut. Those 2 deputy marshals, they weren't far behind. If we were going to have any chance at all, we needed Cortez. Unlike myself, that big Mexican is a hell of a shot. Frank's eyes were wide and wet, and they trembled as they watched over events. Frank's eyes were wide and wet and trembled as they watched old events play again. Once that first shot rang out, there wasn't a trigger without a finger curling around it. Our side started dropping fast. Campbell was first, then the lightning guy. I remember stepping in mud at one point, mud that wasn't mud. It was then that I saw them, really saw them. All them wedding folk. Guests were everywhere. laying in a manner wrong-looking positions where they had dropped. The bride and the groom were still near the altar, one reaching for the other, both covered in blood. Frank moved the glass to his lips, but he couldn't bring himself to drink. Instead, he very nearly retched. It took a few moments before he recovered enough to continue. The worst was that little girl with the flowers. A trembling hand was raised to prod beneath the hat, lifting it just enough so that an old scar was revealed again. The skin there was raised in a long, ragged line, and it throbbed. That nothing guy? Nada, no bueno. He did this just graze, but enough to blind me for all the blood that came pouring. He had flanked us, see? Come around the other side while his partner held us off in the front. I aimed as best as I could, but with all that blood in my eyes, I couldn't see shit. Didn't realize that Cortez was between me and him. He turned just right and bang. Frank turned his fist into an explosion, splaying the fingers to drive the point home. So that's it then. Ellie's voice was flat. That's it. That big Mexican was screaming something awful after that. I thought I killed him at first, but then he started shooting again. This time straight at me. Of course, I ran and, in the commotion, managed to hide. I don't know how, but Cortez ended up making his way to one of the horses and just rode off. Huh, said the bartender, one hand on her hip. So what happened to the deputies? He got one of them in the arm. He was bleeding really bad, but other than that, they got off scot-free. In fact, both got on their horses and rode after the real prize. Ellie cocked her head to one side. They just left you? Well, sure. For all they knew, El Conquistador was the only one left breathing. Hell, there were so many bodies around, all Hodge and I had to do was lay down. Must have been there for 20 minutes before getting up and riding in the opposite direction. A look of distaste washed over the barwoman's face, one that her customer didn't seem to appreciate. To him, it felt a lot like judgment. Don't fool yourself, Ellie darling, he spat. Just because someone hides behind a tin star doesn't mean he gives a damn about right and wrong. People are just people. No matter what side of the law a man is on, dollars are all he really loves. You really believe that? Hell yes, I do. My daddy used to say that every man's got a coin. When he comes into this world to take his first breath, the devil flips that coin. You know, just to see where the kid will end up. The thing is, heads or tails don't matter. All that really does is the coin is money. With enough of that, man can buy most anything. Sweat cascading down his reddened face, Frank moved his hand to cover the woman's. She could feel the wetness between his palm and hers. It was hot, practically boiling. I think you've got the wrong idea here, Miss Ellie offered the statement calmly, helpfully. This isn't that kind of establishment. Besides, she stepped away, wiping the back of her hand on her apron. You look like pounded shit, Frank. What? Frank stood up so fast it felt like his head hadn't joined the rest of his body. I didn't give you my damn name. Part of him knew he was being too loud, making too much of a scene, but that part was difficult to hear, overshadowed as it was by fever and a strange acrid taste down in his throat. Didn't need you to give it, Frank. She said the name as if it were an insult. Then, with a foxy grin and one eye on her customer, a piece of paper was produced from underneath the bar. This was flattened out and slid over. Blinking through the searing sweat, Frank looked down and began to read. Reward, $500. Wanted dead or alive. Notorious bad man, Rattlesnake McGraw. Real name, Francis William Hogue, also known as Whiskey Bill, Frank the Snake, or Frank Hannon, for murder, rape, and robbery of 8 banks. Known for running with the infamous Pete Decker gang. Dark hair, brown eyes, horizontal scar on forehead. The picture was an old one, but it had depicted Frank's unique scar quite prominently. Frank's eyes moved slowly over the type, his mind taking an extra second or two to process it all. Eventually, though, Ellie Costigan heard the distinct sound of a revolver sliding out of its holster. In Frank's mind, he was carrying out a fearsome display, producing iron and pointing it into the delightfully helpless face. The reality, however, fell somewhat short. The movements were sluggish, exaggerated, and when that pistol finally appeared, the bar woman had no trouble swatting it out of her customer's hand. Frank wheeled around, following the trajectory of his weapon as it soared, but the pistol was quickly forgotten. Frank rubbed his eyes, first with his hands and then the backs of his sleeves. What followed was a series of choked partial vocalizations as his eyes moved from table to table. All of them, even that really dark one in the back, was empty. Where? He slurred one word he slurred the one word question, following up following following it up with another. What? He stumbled back, his mind reeling. Then as he looked to the door, he spotted the tiny bell which hung above. That was when Frank's stomach went cold. However badly he wanted the simple explanation to be the right one, that all those other customers couldn't have just gotten up and left. Even if the sounds of scooting chairs and boots on wood had been covered up by his brimming anger, there was no way he would have missed that bell. A shaky hand reached for his revolver. Before Frank remembered, it was no longer there. He spun around back to the bar, but before his vision stopped blurring, there came an explosion of white pain. He was sent stumbling backwards, and as he fell, he slipped away into another place, another phase of matter. The crack of skull on wood was too loud to be real. Though Frank's eyes were open, it was a few seconds before he realized what the coppery taste in his mouth meant. In vain he tried to speak, but with half a tongue, forming words was going to take some time getting used to, likely more than he had. And so he simply lay there, just listening to the mule kick thrum of his heart, trying to understand what in the hell had happened. At that moment, he looked astounded and mortified, like someone had just caught him playing with his pecker. You know what? That look suits you, Frank. Ellie's voice pierced through the veil of fog and consternation. Or should I say rattlesnake? That's what they call you, right? The man on the floor sputtered, coughed, sullying his shirt with brownish red bile. Well, I think that's great, the woman's voice went on, almost poetic, considering what done you in at the end here. The footsteps were plodding and they were getting closer. With what little control Frank had left, he turned his head, causing a mouthful of hot blood to spill on the floor. What? What? Sputtered Frank on the floor. What you gonna do to me? The bar woman's face slid into a wooden sky. The expression was hard. It had transfixed the pretty thing into something else, something better equipped to survive on the surface of the sun. Already done it, darlin'. She got down on her haunches, casually moving the revolver from Frank's hand. Lord in heaven, from his perspective, she seemed 100 feet tall. The stuff isn't easy to make, you know. Hell, most of my previous customers only managed a single glass before getting to where you are now. Gotta say, Frank, you have a hell of a constitution. Ellie sighed, looked out over the tables with somber green eyes. I can see them too, you know. Sometimes. When I look straight on, they always disappear. But every now and then, out of the corner of one eye or in a reflection, she snickered. It's why every night I make sure to serve 'em what they came for, what they can only get here. I find it keeps 'em from, well, from moving on. She pinched that little spot between her eyes, right where the bridge of the nose starts. Suddenly, the woman looked very tired. There are more things in heaven and earth, Horatio. More things by far, said the bartender in a low voice. Tell me, Frank, being a man of culture and all, you ever read any Shakespeare? Eloise Costigan looked down for some sign of recognition, but the man was already dead.